Good evening, everybody. My name is Gary Ostrolenk, and I'll be chairing this fortnightly session of Talking About Socialism, a forum for us to discuss socialist ideas, methods, and history and theory from a Marxist perspective. This session is being live streamed on Facebook. Welcome to anybody who's watching through Facebook. And it's also being recorded and will be made available on the internet subsequently. So please understand that, and if you do have any issues with that, act accordingly. So tonight's session is on nationalisation, public ownership, and Nick has published an article on the subject on the Talking About Socialism website, which I hope you'll be able to see. Hopefully some of you will have read. We've been through an interesting sort of short period of history, actually. First of all, under Corbyn, and then subsequently. In the 2017 and then 2019 manifestos, nationalisation and public ownership seemed like a very radical, bold step to be proposing after decades of neoliberal obsession with privatisation of everything that moved. It's also, we've moved into a period where actually nationalisation, at least for some utilities and industries, can seem like a very mainstream idea that's actually endorsed by many capitalist economists and politicians. So there is a real question about, is nationalisation radical? Is it something that we should fight for? What are the complications and compromises in nationalisation, and where do we stand as Marxists on that issue? So I'll hand over to Nick to do an introduction.
Okay, so comrades, thanks Gary, thanks everybody for coming. In 15 minutes, I'm only going to be able to do a fairly superficial introduction, but I hope that it sparks interest and possibly disagreement, but certainly discussion, because for socialists, the question of how we organize society is central. So the title of the discussion and the title of my article was, or is, what sort of public ownership should socialists call for? Gary's raised the name nationalisation. Some people talk about state ownership. I approach this from a socialist and a communist point of view. To me, those two adjectives mean the same thing. Socialism and communism, a society organised for need, not profit, a society in which the means of production are owned in common. So my answer to the question right at the beginning is that socialists should stand for and aim for the common ownership of the means of production. And by that, I mean the land, the waters upon it, factories, machines, science, and technology. Everything by which we, the producers, interact with nature to add to the store of wealth in society. And the basic proposition from a socialist point of view, in my opinion, is that those means of production should be owned in common rather than, as they are at the moment, owned privately. And by privately, I mean they're owned by what Marx referred to as the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the owners of capital. And it's a very obvious statement to make, and one with which I hope everybody here does agree. There are primarily two classes within society. There are some intermediate classes, but the two main classes are, on the one hand, the very small, the relatively small, compared with the working class, but the relatively small class of owners of capital, the people that own the means of production, the people that own, first of all, the massive multinational organizations that dominate the world economy, world trade, world production, and then going on to perhaps smaller owners of capital. And on the other hand, you have the working class, the producing class, which actually produces the wealth. And in my article, I took exception to the 2017 Labour manifesto, the first Corbyn manifesto, because in that it referred to our entrepreneurs and our managers as if the owners of capital or the managers of capital on behalf of the owners of capital are anything to do with our class, the working class. They're nothing to do with us, and they do not produce wealth. Primarily, the owners of capital in the modern era are owners of the multinational corporations, the massive shareholders, and they basically, that's what they do. They own companies, and they benefit from the dividends that are paid out of the profits that are made, which of course is, from a Marxist point of view, and from any point of view of any serious study, the surplus, the profit, the surplus from which the profit comes is produced by the working class. It's produced by the worker. The worker is only paid for a portion of the time that they work, and the rest is free labor taken, extracted, and owned by the owner of the factory or the workplace, along with the product. So the laborer has worked for free, the worker has worked for free for some of that time. So profit is the unpaid labor of the working class. And so what we have is two classes, the small one and a massive one. The majority of people in society are workers, and they produce the profit on which that tiny class gets fat. Is that 10 minutes gone or 10 minutes left?
10 minutes left.
Thanks, Gary. So I prefer common ownership to public ownership. Public ownership, in a sense, can be taken to mean, I think, in common parlance, public ownership is often a reference to that section of the economy that is owned ostensibly by the state and run by the state, and it's called the public sector, as opposed to the private sector, which is still in private hands. But one of the fundamental points that I want to emphasize here, and there may be disagreement on this, is that state ownership of that public sector is still a sector that has run primarily, if not solely, for the private sector, for the capitalist economy. Because the state in class society is an instrument of class rule. And the state in a capitalist society is essentially the instrument of management and rule on behalf of the capitalist class. Now, I've got some quotes, if I've got time later on, to show how Marx and Engels referred to the nationalisation or the state ownership of the means of production under capitalism, referring to the workers that were employed in those sectors still as wage labour, as wage slaves, and we still have capitalism. That is a society, an economy that is producing for profit. But if we were to get common ownership, that is ownership of the means of production, it would involve abolition of capitalist ownership. It would involve abolition of the capitalist system. And so I pose in the questions that were sent around for this meeting, is it utopian or outlandish or unrealistic for socialists to put forward the demand for the abolition of capitalism? And it does seem to me that far too often and too many people who are socialists, and particularly a lot of people who are Marxists, who agree with the idea of the common ownership of the means of production, who agree with the idea, at least theoretically, that capitalism needs to be abolished and replaced by a new mode of production, a new system, are quite often too timid to put it forward on the argument that this won't be understood by people, that it makes us seem like almost like mad people that put forward such an outrageous argument. My argument is to the contrary, that unless those people who agree with the concept of common ownership and production for need, not profit, unless those people put forward confidently and boldly the need for a new form of society based on common ownership, then it will never get support because people will never hear the arguments. And so we have to make the argument for common ownership. The key question for socialists, therefore, as indeed for any thinking person in society, is what's the best society that we can have? And is it possible to have a different form of society in which we don't have the constant toil and stress of work over which we have no control? And of course, we have no control and no say in the allocation of the wealth that we create. The vast bulk of humanity, the international working class, either works at the beck and call of the owners or joins the reserve army of labour, that which the present system cannot use productively. If we look around the world, and I only have 5 minutes left, so can't really go into this in detail, but in my article, I dealt with water as just one example of why we need common ownership, of how privatisation has been used to ransack the public till, to ransack and loot the public, that the private ownership of water, of education, of energy, we can see very starkly how the capitalist class is really interested only in making a profit. And it can't actually meet the basic needs of society, that is to provide clean water to drink, to bathe in. It can't provide sanitation that is efficient. And we have the devastating leaks into or discharges into the rivers and seas. On a global scale, we have a similar situation, but writ large. Capitalism, which has been in existence certainly for perhaps 150, if not years, if not much longer in Britain and elsewhere, we now have a situation, we've got 8 billion people, we've got 2.2 billion people who do not have safely managed drinking water. I'm going to have to cut all of these statistics out and pose some questions. Marx and Engels, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, they wrote this: the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slaves within its slavery. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. my question to socialists and to others with whom we want to have the conversation is, were Marx and Engels right 175 years ago? And is what they said then even more the case now? With all of the progress that has been made, with the size of the working class, the relative weakness of the ruling class, are we not in a position now to take control and ownership of the wealth of society, the means of production, and use it for the benefit of all? I'll stop there, Gary, thanks.
Thank you very much, Nick. Stopped with a minute to spare, so that's very good. So I would now like to open the discussion to the floor. The timings that we use for these sessions is to give each speaker 3 minutes to speak, which I know isn't long, but it does allow everybody to make a contribution if they want to. And then if we still have time after the first round of speakers, then people who've already spoken can come back again for another slot. So if you'd like to speak, if you raise your digital hand on Zoom, if you can't work out how to raise your digital hand, then wave your arm in the air with your video on, and I'm sure I'll pick you up. So I have one speaker lined up so far, which is Ian. So over to you, Ian.
Good evening, comrades. I just obviously want to draw attention to the very important point that Nick has made. It's the distinction between, if you like, state property and the common ownership of the means of production. In a sense, we're no better off with the state ownership of the means of production than we are with than with capitalism. Let's just take an example. People get very dewy-eyed over the National Health Service. And I speak as someone who's worked in the National Health Service since I was 17 years old, and I would die to defend the right of for free healthcare. But let's understand that the National Health Service came into being by the nationalisation of pre-existing poor law institutions and private institutions and so on. So this is precious little to do with socialism, although free healthcare would be an intrinsic part of a socialist society. So there are bits that we can identify as laudable, but there are bits that are just not part of socialism, and the NHS isn't inherently socialist. The important thing here is the common ownership of the means of production, that workers themselves control these things through direct participative democracy. If you just end up with a kind of workers' administration, little chunks. I mean, if socialism in one country is impossible, then socialism in one factory is even more ridiculous. Just remember what happened to the Meridian Workers' Cooperative at Triumph, for example, Triumph motorbikes. Effectively, workers were told, well, you can take control of it, it'll be a workers' cooperative and you can make motorbikes. Well, all that meant was they effectively ended up presiding over their own demise and didn't get the kind of redundancy payments they would have got if they'd just been paid off. Ridiculous nonsense. So what I'm opposed to is the idea that nationalisation constitutes some kind of socialism in practice. Nationalisation is just, and often it's taken place, as with the British Rail or with the mines, for example, because they were bankrupt anyway. They were going to go down the toilet, but they were strategically important, so they were nationalised. And it didn't make the slightest bit of difference if you were working underground in a coal mine in a nationalised coal mine or a private one. And quite often people are worse off, because if the state decides not to fund the thing properly, you can end up in an impoverished workforce, in an impoverished workplace. My point here is that nationalisation can only really take place in a revolutionary situation. We might need to nationalise things to save people's jobs. We might need to nationalise things in order to ensure that the services continue to run, because we know for a fact that the capitalist class will go on strike as soon as workers take power. So I'll leave it at that.
Wind up,
I appreciate it. I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great, thank you. Oh God, now I don't know how to turn off my timer. Right, so I've got one more speaker lined up so far. I would encourage other people to think about making a contribution and remind you all that this is a very friendly bunch and there's nothing daunting about speaking. We're not demanding highly academic interventions. This is just a chat really about ideas. So please do feel confident in putting your hand up and contributing. So Chris, over to you with 3 minutes.
Thank you, Gary. Evening, comrades. Ian's made lots of the points that I would have made as well, so I'm going to pivot from that. One concern that I would have, and I think we as Marxists should have with nationalisation, is that we would break up the multinationals and the big corporate blocks into competing national blocks and all of the dangers that come along with that. In terms of war, in terms of trade wars, competition, and what have you. But listening to one of the things I would want to discuss is what socialization of industry and services would look like if not following the nationalization model that we have done previously. We'd need to go for a democratic one. For example, I work in a sixth form college. How would that work? My understanding would be that we would have an elected board or committee or something. It'd be made up of workers and importantly be made up of students as well. They would collectively decide on education, on the timetable. There'd be elected positions that would be recallable and everything else with term limits. And then if you go down that road, then the next step obviously is that you'd require a wider reform of the education system, and workers and students having a greater say in how that system is run. I think one of the important reasons we should raise students or users, or or as my principle says, customers, which is a strange one to call 16 and 17-year-olds. The importance of workers and users democratically planning services together. We don't need to look at the state of the NHS and the way patients and their families are ignored or brushed under the table when something happens, or alternatively, the nurses, doctors, or technicians are thrown to the wolves when gross mismanagement and underfunding results in avoidable deaths and disease. I think Ian was right. Many sectors we could see people taking more of an active role, but that would have to be generalized and have to be as a defensive measure up until a point that the working class is not only able to impose its will into a specific industry or a specific service, but also to impose its political will on the whole of society, both in Britain and abroad. And I think that requires a working class to be strong enough to take political power. And for me, that requires us to have an independent working class communist party. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Chris. That was bang on time. Very good. So I have another speaker lined up in Soraya. Soraya, over to you with 3 minutes.
Right, thanks, Gary. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, sorry about you having to take over. The chairing. I just got a series of questions, really. I think that in reformism seems much more attractive, appears easier to achieve, and I think that's why people, the soft left, argue for things like, I can't even remember what the expression is, but Preston's held up as some sort of marvelous model of sort of proto-socialism. I'm not quite sure why or how, but it's essentially because you don't have to argue for a radical change in society. But my questions are, obviously, when we've seen state control of public services, and I'm all in favour of that, funding is unequal and sporadic and whatever's flavour of the month. And so it isn't managed, because essentially it's not managed by the people who use it, but by government bureaucrats. It's not the step forward that better than private ownership, but we all know what a mess the health service, education, etc. is in. My question really is, how would it be organised differently? Talk about workers' administration. Practically, how, because I'm all in favour of workers and youth and everybody being involved in the organisation and the planning, but in detail, how would that work? How do we see that working? And how do we get, I know we need a revolution to get from where we are now to there, but in terms of, I suppose, interim demands, we have to take control, but then more practically, how and who and so on.
Thank you, Soraya. So I don't see any other hands up right now. So Minnie has raised her hand. Fantastic. I'll take Minnie next, and then I'll come in and make a contribution myself. So over to you, Minnie, with 3 minutes.
Hiya. Yeah, just to say, one of the arguments against nationalisation, and it could be used against common ownership, is that capitalism gives us innovation. It drives innovation. Now, if you look at the Lucas plan in the 70s, that was going to be a workers' buyout, a common ownership thing. And instead of making, weapons, basically, they decided they could change production to useful work, useful production, which is what I want a revolution to bring about. Obviously, we've got to find the right way to do it. Now that they saw the future, the workers saw the future, the engineers, the workers, they saw wind turbines, public transport that could be green. They wanted to build dialysis machines for health. They really did see, can you imagine if that was linked internationally, workers? And I think it shouldn't just be workers administrating. I think it should be communities involved, especially with climate change, and each community having different, you may have a tidal basin, you may have wind, lots of land, you can put wind stuff on, you may have a shore. There's all sorts of different things in different environments, different kinds of housing. Another thing the Lucas plan wanted to do was build heat pumps for houses. So this thing about, capitalism drives innovation. Well, those engineers and those workers, they were coming up with those ideas well ahead of the time. Imagine if internationally we'd done that, linked up and done that many years ago. We wouldn't be... Anyway, climate change and all that. Also, unfortunately, yeah, I do agree that it needs to be common ownership, and we need to look at what kind of ownership that would be. And I think communities should be involved. I know that, for example, I know someone who worked for the nationalised energy company, energy board, when that was a nationalised industry sector, whatever. And as soon as that was privatised in the Northwest, for example, by Scottish Power, the first things, even from nationalisation, the privatisation was terrible. They cut safety, they cut spare, they cut the tools for the workers on the job. They then cut workers. So this, whatever we do, it obviously is not going to be about profit. Is that my 3 minutes?
It is, yeah. Sorry, Minnie.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So great, I've got a couple more speakers put their hands up. I'm going to take myself now and please contain me to 3 minutes. So it's interesting. So I certainly agree with what the speakers have said about the difference between state ownership and common ownership and control by workers. And certainly nationalized services, nationalized utilities, nationalized industries are not socialism. They're not even harbingers of socialism. But I do think that as Marxists intervening in the class struggle, we have to take a slightly more complicated view of this issue, because actually nationalization of public services, nationalization of industries are things that we have to fight for. And why do we have to fight for them? We have to fight for them for a number of reasons, I would suggest. One is that they just inevitably, within the logic of capitalism, provide the scale that is needed, right? And scale is an inherent issue with the progress of capitalism into communism. Capitalism itself needs to grow scale inexorably, and nationalization is a form of that larger scale with economies and savings. The second thing is that nationalized services and industries provide a level of democratic accountability under capitalism. So it's capitalist bourgeois democracy, I know, but nonetheless, we do have influence through Parliament of nationalized services and industries. We have an influence over the NHS, for instance, that we don't have over a private company. The third thing is it raises a question very explicitly of how to plan for an industry-wide or a service-wide organization that you don't get within private companies that are competing with each other. And it also, I would suggest, highlights the existence of profits within privatized industries that don't exist under state control in the same way, not as directly. So actually, I think that nationalization is something that we have to fight for, and for those sorts of reasons. And I think that we have to find a way of being able to simultaneously fight for nationalization, defend the public ownership or the state ownership of the NHS. It's important for us to defend it, but at the same time to make, to get across our vision that we need to go way beyond that in creating common ownership of all production under socialism. So we can't lose sight of either, I would suggest. So I'll close myself there. Thank you. Next up is Steve. Steve, if you're ready, you've got 3 minutes from now.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, I've just watched the news there, Channel 4 News, and I heard a story during the day, but they got some comedians, Lee Mack and Steve Coogan, and they're at Lake Windermere today. So this is made the headline news on 5 Live, and it's they're there tonight, Lake Windermere. They're having a bit of a comedy gig, but it's also the serious business to keep sewage out of Lake Windermere. And on the face of it, you might think, why is this important? Well, it's really important there because Lee Mack is extremely, I find some of the stuff he does quite amusing. And he's quite popular, quite well known. He's just been on Channel 4 News saying about the profits. They're making £300 million that they're giving to, this is called United Utilities. They're making £300 million profits that they're giving to shareholders. And they're only spending £19 million on the money for the removal of the sewage, which is a drop in the ocean, as he says, towards the removal of the sewage. And even Lee Mack is on the news there saying, well, maybe they should reverse that and give the £300 million instead of why are they even giving the money to the shareholders? They should be resolving their problem first. And you see, for me, the other example that we can look at is this one. We're only short of time, but this one also that I saw today, and these stories are coming up very regularly. So wholesale gas is 12.5 cheaper this morning than it was in August, cheaper than it was more than 2 years ago. In July, the energy bill will be 80% higher than it was 2 years ago. The price you pay has soared. Yet British Gas made £3.3 billion last year. I think what this whole question of privatisation and nationalisation does, it allows us and gives us the opportunity as socialists, Marxists, to really raise the question of who controls the economy. Because ultimately, who controls the economy? Because these issues cannot be solved unless we own our water, unless we own our energy. They cannot be and that even so, even through the medium of comedians here, we can raise the. So it isn't a question of shareholders. It is a question of ownership. The ownership, yeah, it's a technical issue about what is common ownership, what is nationalisation. But I'm talking about in a society where there's not a lot of the raising of socialist ideas, it's a really important tool for us to raise who controls society and who controls the wealth in society. And I think that's really important. The other question, and perhaps I'm just sort of throwing in, is then there's a report from Unite Union that they're in favour of energy nationalisation, but it's going to cost £90 billion to nationalise it in compensation to every single shareholder. So just to wind up, we would obviously say no compensation except on the basis of proven need, which also raises the question of who controls the wealth, who controls the companies, and who controls society. And I think that's the way we've got to look at this debate. Thanks, Gary.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you. So I've got one more speaker lined up, which is Neil. But before I bring Neil in, could those of you who haven't spoken yet seriously have a think about what you would like to say about this, or even what you think about what other people have said? So great, over to you, Neil, for 3 minutes.
Okay. Sort of a lot of what I was going to say has been said, but I'll sort of try and add to it. I think, like what Gary was saying, nationalisation is important to argue for from where we are. Both, as Steve was saying, because it raises the debate of who owns the wealth in society and how it's distributed and controlled. But also we can expand what nationalisation means. So why doesn't it mean broadband and even mobile phone access? Why doesn't it mean food even? You know, these are the questions. Why should anybody have their life limited by necessities they can't afford to buy? And we can make those arguments as socialists. I think also, you know, it's been mentioned before, the Lucas plan. So nationalisation tends to be this capitalist company will be owned by the government instead of private interest, but it doesn't really change the nature of that company. Whereas we can argue through things like the Lucas plan that you know, a company like Toyota doesn't have to just make cars under socialism. It can make, you know, it can be reconfigured to make any product that's necessary on a heavy industry basis. We don't need to have this competition between different car manufacturers. We can, you know, if we're manufacturing for need, then the whole idea of separate, you know, industrial sectors sort of fades into the distance. So arguing for nationalisation, but not leaving it at what we understand it at the moment as a social democratic thing, allows us to push the argument a lot further. And also, if I understood Soraya's question right, the transitions that, you know, transitional demands and stuff that we make, we need to make those now. This is what we should be arguing for now. If we ever get to a situation where a revolution is possible, it means that the workers are already understanding, they're already conscious of their power, they're understanding their what's against them and everything, and they would already be thinking about these issues about ownership, about control of society, about the distribution of wealth. So yeah, I think I'll just leave it there. We need to, you know, the transitions that we need to make now, not once the revolution's here or you know, once we've nationalised everything.
Thank you very much, Neil. Much appreciated. Finishing slightly early. So next speaker with a hand up is Joe Devine. Joe, if you can unmute yourself, you're on for 3 minutes.
Hiya, thanks. I was just going to make a contribution on what kind of public ownership we don't want, and maybe how we shouldn't try and go about getting it. And really, it's a bit of an entry-level contribution on who's going to implement the policy. But I think the point is it's from the 2019 period, and I think that basic entry-level kind of points we failed on those counts. I wanted to take some quotes from Labour's policy document that it put out before the 2019 general election called Bringing Energy Home, Labour's proposal for publicly owned energy networks. It was talking about the formation of a national energy agency. And on page 12 of the document, it says that on day one after nationalisation, the transmission company owned by the National Energy Agency will look near identical to the privatised electricity transmission operator, but in public ownership. Well, that's grand, isn't it? That's the public ownership we want then. It's going to win adherence from the get-go by looking identical to the privatised version. I don't think I'm quoting that document unfairly, because then it goes on page 17 to talk about the process. How do we transition? And it says, energy distribution and transmission will be brought into public ownership immediately, and in the short term will continue functioning on the same scale and broadly the same manner as before. The day after public ownership is implemented will look almost identical to the day before, with companies managed by the same professionals. The process of transforming publicly owned network companies into the nested participatory transparent institutions set out above will take longer and will be achieved over the course of Labour's first term. So if I've got that right, they're saying that in the short term, the publicly owned energy companies would consider continued functioning in broadly the same manner as before. And on the day one of ownership on behalf of the people will look almost identical to the day before. Well, that's not inspired at all, is it? But who's going to implement that policy? They say that it will be managed by the same professionals. Well, by that, I'm presuming they're talking about the pre-existing cadre of capitalist managers here. So those same professionals are the same people currently running the national grid and SSE, the people who own the gas and electricity transmission networks. And those are the same professionals who promptly created overseas holding companies so that they could transfer ownership of their British operations abroad, precisely in order to combat that renationalisation pledge. So those would be the same professionals who they were entrusting with the responsibility of initiating this process of transforming their companies into your nested participatory transparent institutions, whatever one of those are. So I think really it's a practical necessity to talk about removing people from a strategic position of control over vital infrastructure if they're totally against the policy of public ownership, because otherwise you'd have people who are about as willing to help Corbyn as the PDVSA managers were to assist Chavez. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. A very important insight there into the thinking that was behind the manifesto from 2019. So I don't have any other speakers lined up yet. I would invite you again, all of you, to think about whether there's anything further you'd like to say, whether or not you've spoken before. In the meantime, I'd like to invite Nick back to respond to the things that have been said so far. Nick, are you?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as I feared, I didn't even get to the heart of what I wanted to say in my opening, but everybody else has got there before me, which is great. And I thought Joe's last contribution went to the heart of the matter in many ways, because the question for socialists is what form of what sort of common ownership do we want? And the question then arises, how do we get it? So what is it we're aiming for? And I personally think it's extremely important that we don't give the impression that somehow, and this is the common view on the left in the labour and trade union movement, that we want some sort of repeat of the 1945 Labour government. The 1945 Labour government had extensive nationalisation, and the same people ran those nationalised companies as ran it when it was in private hands. They ran those companies, those utilities and those services primarily to service the private sector, to give cheap coal, cheap electricity, cheap energy, and so on. So yes, we can look at nationalisation and say, well, the NHS, that's something that we need to protect, and we do. But whilst we have capitalism, what we've got, the Labour Party now is teeing up for the privatisation or the extension of privatisation and the market into the NHS when Labour comes to power. And that's one of the reasons why Labour has been getting rid of all remnants of Corbyn and the left and so on, in order to be able to do precisely that. So if you look at what Corbyn and the manifestos propose, say, take rail, it talked about taking over the rail franchises as they came up for renegotiation. In some cases, I think that would go into sort of 15 years hence. The other side of it is we're talking from a socialist or a communist point of view of changing society. So we've got to argue and vie for the working class coming to power. If the working class comes to power, it means changing the nature of the state, getting rid of the capitalist state and inaugurating a new one. So to take up some of the points that Soraya and others raise, it means having working class control, management, democratically running, planning, and so on. How that will be organized, Marx was notoriously, he would not set out blueprints for the future. That will be for future generations to organize how we do that. But it will be direct democracy, owned, controlled, managed, democratically planned by the working class. It will be a state of the working class, not of the capitalist class. And one of the key tasks that that state will have to do or to carry out will be the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, getting rid of the profit system. I just want, because it's been raised, I just want to share one quote, if I may, Gary, and it might prompt other discussion. So, sorry, let me just find it. It's really dealing with what people were saying about, oh, I'll have to find it. I can't find it to share with, so I'll leave it there. I know I've got it. Can I just share my screen? Okay, so this is, right, so people were talking about nationalisation and arguing to protect nationalisation. And from a point of view of the efficient management of capitalism, then you could say that water, energy, rail need to be centralised and run by the state. But capitalists also recognize that, they realize that. Engels and Marx pointed how capitalism concentrates capital. And there's two processes taking place. One is the creation of a massive proletariat, making it even stronger and more viable to take control of society. And the second is the formation of capital into big entities, which make it easier for the state to take control. And I'm just going to read this out. The modern state is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the general external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the encroachments as well of workers as of individual capitalists. The modern state, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of the capitalists, the ideal personification of the total national capital. The more it proceeds to the taking over of productive forces, the more does it actually become the national capitalist, the more citizens does it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. And then it says, just jumping a bit, state ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution. And then this, the proletariat seizes political power and turns the means of production in the first instance into state property. But in doing this, it abolishes itself as the proletariat, abolishes all class distinctions and class antagonisms, abolishes also the state as state. And so, in my opinion, it's absolutely...
Can you wind up, Nick, please?
Yeah, I'm going to stop there, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Great. So, and if you could unshare your screen again, please.
Yeah,
Nick.
I'm trying to find out how to do that. Okay, sorry. Stop. There we go. Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's great. Very interesting. Okay, so I got Ian and Minnie lined up to speak next. Ian, over to you for 3 minutes again, please.
We should also acknowledge, comrades, that a lot of people's experience of nationalisation was just bloody awful. Having lived in the Soviet Union and having lived through the 1970s, most people's experience of nationalisation was dreadful. I mean, growing up in a two-bedroom council flat in London with no central heating or whatever was not a good example of metropolitan socialism. So, okay, here's my idea as a person who's just been appointed by an overwhelming mandate from the working class as People's Commissar for the health of the nation. The first thing is, hospitals are nasty, dirty places full of sick people. Let's move emphasis away from hospitals as such, because they are actually just factories of disease rather than health facilities. We need to, if we really are serious about health, we need to cut the working week to about 10 hours. And that means the elimination of wage labour insofar as is humanly possible. There will be, of course, a need for necessary labour, but imagine the difference that will make to health. Not just basics of healthcare, but nutrition. I mean, goodness, how much more essential does it have to be? Free food, at least the basics. I'm not suggesting a free foie de gras or whatever, but I'm certainly suggesting that a minimum basic income from the outset would be an essential pre-requirement. And all of these contribute to health. Housing. How many people have died as a result of just damp, crowded housing? Transport. Just very, very simple things could be made free almost overnight. And still make a huge contribution to health. Doesn't extend to, isn't just about hospitals, it isn't just about doctors, nurses, or whatever. Of course, if you need important surgery or something like that, of course we're still going to need those sorts of facilities. We're still going to need that sort of expertise. But health is much more to do with just the very means of life. I mean, the Rosetto case study in the 1960s showed how just the simple measure of having a hierarchically flat society where people have enough to eat drastically improved coronary health, for example, and improved overall life expectancy. So cut the working week to 10 hours would be the most important thing. And at the earliest opportunity, because after all, the vast majority of things that are the jobs that people do, things like the police or the banks or the rest of it, are utterly worthless, create nothing to meet human need whatsoever. That's the important thing. And the other point about it is, and the reason why this has to happen in a revolutionary situation, is there can't be any compensation for the bourgeoisie. If you're going to nationalise stuff, I mean, all that happened in 1945 was, of course, the bourgeoisie were laughing all the way to the bank. The people who own these useless railway companies and useless coal mines were given huge amounts of compensation. We can't go along with bourgeois law.
Thanks, Ian. Great, thank you. So I've got Minnie next. Then I think I'll take myself again. Minnie, over to you for 3 minutes.
Yeah, I like what Ian said. It's much better than the spin of the prevention agenda for health. That's fantastic. What Ian said there, how our health could be improved. I was going to talk about the NHS actually, and one of the things I'm going to talk about, obviously we can't trust the state. We couldn't trust Starmer if he got in the state, and as Ian pointed out in the chat, we couldn't trust a Stalinist state. And what we're getting is lies, and we need to expose lies. Our NHS in England has been broken up. They said they weren't going to, we know Tories lies anyway, they weren't going to, privatise it. It's been broken up into, is it 42 or 44 ICBs, integrated care boards? There's less democracy. There's less local council sitting on there, less local bodies, less patient input. The American health companies we know are involved. We know that the NHS logo now is just a logo. It's all being taken away from us. What we had even, the private sector is going to be used. It was already, they were given money during the pandemic. This government actually used a pandemic to further privatise and further and give money to, was it Michelle Mone and you name it. There's another one now who's trying to, he was given loads of money, was a buddy of someone, and he's now trying to crash the company so he doesn't have to publish the accounts because he's taken millions. I we need to take it. We need to take what's ours, basically. Is that it? Thank you, Gary. You're making some funny signs.
Sorry, Minnie. No, carry on. You still got a minute.
Yeah, we've still got a minute.
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Yeah. So, well, that's it. That's really it. What I wanted to say, really, that there's the lies, the lack of democracy, the greed. We need things run by us, for us. Useful work, useful production, within an international framework where, you know, you wouldn't be competing and people wouldn't be making things, you know, you wouldn't have to say, oh, we can't afford that, we can't afford that. And people's health really should be the first thing. And I really liked what Ian said about all those ideas. So true. Thank you.
Thank you, Minnie. Thank you. And by the way, I wasn't gesticulating at you. I was gesticulating at somebody at the other end of the house, and I forgot I was on the screen. So nothing personal. Apologize if it looked like that. I'm going to take myself briefly next, and then I've got Alan has his hands up. So I think what that document that Joe drew our attention to was really revealing. It shows you that we have to talk about the purpose of the nationalisation and the purpose of the nationalised organisation, and we have to talk about who is running it and under what criteria. And I think there are both really important things that clearly Corbyn's team completely looked away from and ignored, to be honest, in the 2019 manifesto, and are ones that we as socialists should always be raising. I mean, if we look at the NHS, who's running it? Well, at best, it's been run by the consultants, right? At best. At worst, it's been run by a whole layer of bureaucrats and apparatchiks that are political appointments. But at best, we could say it's been run by the consultants, and they run it really badly around their own vested interests. Okay, they also ran it around a principle of getting people back to work rather than preventing illness, preventing ill health. And those are but just two examples of how we could frame our arguments in defense of the NHS, but for a far better NHS. If we look at the energy sector and national ownership of the energy sector, I mean, even though at one level, the Labour manifesto talked about nationalising the sector front to back, it actually sidestepped the whole question about the major global energy suppliers and what we would do about them. And of course, it completely sidestepped the issue of how energy suppliers are embroiled up to their necks in oppression and torture around the world, and devastating pollution, and so on. And so I think, you know, we have to be raising those sorts of issues in any discussion about nationalisation. And if we look at housing, just very briefly, I mean, I think housing is a really good example where it is obvious that, for instance, the council house building programs of the 50s, 60s and 70s were hugely important and positive. And there is absolutely no doubt that the council flats that were created as parts of those programs were a massive improvement for people over the private slum landlords that they dealt with previously. But we have to, again, also look at what we want in terms of democratic control. And right now we are fighting for council housing as opposed to housing association housing, for instance, and for council housing as opposed to private housing. But who controls it, for what purpose, in what interests, are the questions we have to raise. So I shall close there and hand over to Alan, please. 3 minutes from now.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, just basically the point that I think Ian was talking about earlier, which is about, so I mean, picture's gone. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you, Alan.
You can hear me. That's fine. Yeah, it's about this, you know, the idea that is always presented that capitalism is the most efficient way of running things, and that obviously nationalisation is inefficient. And I think, for me, the book that really sort of changed, one of the books that changed my life, was a book I read about 3 or 4 years ago by David Graeber, who is an anarchist who wrote about bullshit jobs. The name of the book was Bullshit Jobs, and it wasn't him saying that people's work was bullshit. collected information from people that wrote to him, and he came to the conclusion that 40% of all the work that's out there is actually not needed to be done, and that we could get away with abolishing 40% of all the work, or in other words, cutting people's hours down by 40%, and it wouldn't make an inch of difference to society. And I think, if we're looking for things that we can sell to people that as a way of pushing forward a change in society, the idea that we have a universal basic income and that we get rid of all the crap jobs and we just share the work out that's left amongst everybody for the luxuries, it's almost like a transitional demand, I think, that we can be making to get people instilled in the idea that privatisation of the economy, all the jobs out there in finance and competing with each other, are just, most of them are completely superfluous for the needs of society, and we could get rid of them all tomorrow and get rid of this myth that nationalisation is somehow more inefficient than the private sector, which doesn't have any waste whatsoever. But the second point I was going to make is about the classic example that dates back to when I lived in Sheffield in 1981, 82, is that every single bus fare in Sheffield was 2p, and it was practically a free bus service. And this is something that was achievable in the 1970s and the 1980s when we were supposed to be so much worse off. Obviously, it couldn't be seen to continue, so Thatcher abolished it. It was one of the things she did. But the idea of free public transport is something that is completely achievable now. But the reason why we're not doing it is because the government has got an aversion to income tax, and everything has got to be taxed directly. So therefore, petrol tax is 75% of the price of petrol goes on taxation. So the government is completely reliant on people being in the cars and driving out in the cars. It doesn't want a public transport system because it doesn't want you not using your car. And I think this sort of idea that we can actually put, we've achieved this in the past, and we could achieve it once again as a transitional demand if we called for free public transport across the country, not even cheap public transport, free public transport funded through general income tax, which is considered to be a fair tax compared to indirect taxation. And it would also help towards the sort of climate crisis, all the petrol use we've got. If you drive around the cities now, and it's absolutely unbearable, the cities and the amount of traffic that's out there. And I just think these ideas about, they aren't the solution. The solution obviously is a socialist society, but we've got to get there. And I think there's a lot of people out there looking for new ideas for how we could run the world, particularly the younger generation. And the idea of a much reduced working week, universal basic income, get rid of means-tested pensions, get rid of mean-tested benefits, all those jobs would go because there'd be no need to do it. And then we tie it in with things like free public transport, which is completely achievable and doesn't really alter anything out there for the economy as a whole, but it's something that we could actually make some achievements on. And there's still the idea that the public sector is something we should be doing.
Thanks, Alan.
That's basically it. Sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I've now got Janet with your hand up. So over to you for 3 minutes, Janet.
Yeah, just as sorry, I'll take that. Just a few random things, really. About health and the NHS. I mean, I certainly agree with Ian. These ideas, I mean, what he's talking about clearly isn't new. He's put something in the chat about something worked because it was social despite poverty. I mean, I think the main issue is always around inequality and why we're in a situation where people become ill is much worse in a society which is unequal. But I mean, there's been a massive amount of research around health inequalities and so on, and we all know that in the last 5-10 years that we're actually going backwards. So I don't disagree with what you said. I mean, clearly good housing, good education, a decent environment, all of those things are more important than anything around even the structures or the National Health Service, which is the end product of a system that is failing. So I don't disagree. I certainly agree with you about that. I'm not sure though, maybe just because I'm confused, maybe it would be better, we can talk about the principles of all this, but if you're looking at how to do something, I'm not sure talking about the nationalisation of health or housing, for example, as opposed to global corporate private organizations. Maybe we should just be talking about the democratization of those services. I think that's a more helpful way of looking at it, because we're not talking about nationalizing health. On housing, that, you know, it's a bit more complex, and some council housing was good and some was awful. I think that's a bit simplistic, but I think it's right. You know, Gary's saying we are talking about council housing, but that doesn't, and we all know that we want to push, you know, whoever is in government for a massive council house building program, but it doesn't then actually deal with housing as you know, a commodity, about the housing market and so on. So we haven't talked about that, but I mean, I don't think you can talk about increasing council housing without looking at private sector housing and the way housing works in our society. But those are just a few random thoughts.
Thank you very much, Janet. So, Caroline, Minnie, I see your hand is up, but I'm assuming that's from your previous contribution, is that? It is, yes, great. Okay, so would anybody else like to make a contribution now? Chris, great. Chris, over to you for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Gary. So I just wanted to agree and pick up on something that Minnie said about innovation. You know, capitalism does constantly revolutionize production, not always for the good of society, but always certainly for profit. But what this has given us is an industrial and technical base for us to achieve socialism, where we can live a high standard of life, where labor is reduced to a bare minimum, 10 hours maybe, where nature is protected and everything else. I think that's an important point for us to make more widely, is that whilst we want to supersede capitalism, we are aware that what it has delivered humanity is the basis for a free life, for a free society. I was also very interested in what you said, Gary, on nationalisation in terms of giving some democratic oversight in Parliament. I think to some extent that is true. But when we talk about that, then that inevitably leads to another demand, another position for the working class to take, which is the opening of the books, both in terms of what's on company ledgers, but also what deals have been made by government in trade departments, in diplomacy, and what have you. And I think once we start pulling at that thread, you know, the whole gamut of the way the capitalist state manages nationalized entities and how it serves a wider purpose for profit making in the wider economy will be plain to see. I also wanted to come back to Ian and say that the bourgeoisie will be compensated when we take everything off them. You know, their compensation will be a free world, a free life, and a 10-hour working week. What more would they want?
Thank you very much, Chris. Much appreciated. Okay, so I don't have any more hands up. If anybody else would like to speak or speak again, feel free. We've still got a little bit of time. If not, I will hand it back to Nick in a minute. I mean, it's been a really interesting discussion ranging over a number of different perspectives on public ownership, shared ownership, nationalisation, both in terms of whether we fight for it, whether it's something that we should be associated with, how we should fight for it, what we should demand, and how we should avoid falling into a trap of just bolstering up the bourgeois state. And I think there's a lot of different details that have come out of that discussion that I found really interesting. So it looks like nobody else is putting their hand up. So I would like to invite Nick now to sum up, please.
Well, comrades, thanks, Gary. It's been an excellent discussion. Loads of really interesting and pertinent points that have been raised. And what it suggests to me is that we actually need a lot more discussions, perhaps going into more detail in terms of what program we as communists or socialists, Marxists, would put forward here and now. For me, that means a program. What would we do if we were in government? How would we approach it? Or what would we do if we were standing in elections? What would we be arguing for? I think the first thing, though, that I want to come back to is, and it's going back to the Communist Manifesto, because Marx 175 years ago argued that communists at every stage of the class struggle should constantly put forward the property question to the fore. And what he meant by that was who owns, who controls, and in whose interests is society run. And what we're trying to grapple with is how do we change things? One of the big questions, I think, is that do people accept that there is the possibility of change, and change to what? So just going through some of the points as they were being raised, I think first of all, if you look at the size of the working class and the development of modern capitalism, I would argue that we have the basis in society and in the development of technology, technique, science, etc., for a socialist society to be established in the here and now. And in fact, Engels was arguing that at the end of the 19th century. In my opinion, society is rotten ripe for communism, for socialism. How do we get there? Well, we have to have an organized and conscious working class that knows what it's fighting for, knows what its aim is. If you go into battle not knowing what your aim is, not knowing what you're fighting for, then you're disorganized and you're less likely to achieve your aim because you're not really clear about it. In my opinion, the working class has to set on its banner abolition of capitalism. When Marx wrote a pamphlet called Wages, Prices and Profit in 1865, he argued in that the trade union movement should put on its banner abolition of the wages system, which seems a little obtuse perhaps, but what he's talking about is getting rid of the exploitation of labour for profit for a few. And actually that kernel of an argument, I think, is easily understood by any worker or members of their family, because most workers know exactly what they're there to do. They're there to help make a profit for their boss. And if we want the things that Ian and Minnie and others have argued for, a shorter working week, better health, then it means that we have to fight for the abolition of the profit system. We have to fight for the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production. And the reason for that is the creation of value, the creation of profit means the exploitation of the worker in the workplace. And the reason that we don't have the investment into the water facilities, for example, for the 3 billion people that don't have access to water, is because it doesn't make the capitalists the profit. They don't approach things on the basis of the needs of society. They approach investment on the basis of what makes a profit. And a nationalized state ownership of a so-called public sector slots into that. Yes, there is a class struggle over control or management or how the public sector is utilized, is managed, and our class tries to exert pressure. But the pressure is always coming from the other side, from the private sector, to make the state act in its will. I mean, just one way of looking at this. The capitalist class has to contribute to the funding of the capitalist state through its taxation. It doesn't want to do that. And so it's going to constantly put pressure on the government which is the administration of the capitalist state, to get rid of workers in the public sector, to make them work faster, longer, and harder in the public sector, to reduce the amount of wages that are paid in the public sector, because they don't want the state spending the money that they have to contribute in taxes. And therefore you get situations, so for example, the Labour government of the 1970s under Harold Wilson and then Callaghan ends up with the winter of discontent because it's putting pay restraint on the public sector, areas that it controlled. And so what we have to fight for as socialists is not just an increased public sector in the capitalist state, that is increased nationalisation. We have to fight for a complete change in the way that society is organised. And in the article that I wrote, I raised the question, it's relatively easy for people to see in certain aspects of the economy, public services, utilities as they're called, water, gas, electricity, rail, health, education. It's very easy in those particular sectors for people to understand that it isn't right, as they see it, for those sectors to be making a profit. Why should anybody make a profit out of providing water so that people can drink or flush their lavatory? It seems ludicrous and outrageous. The same with health. Why should anybody make profit out of getting treatment in a hospital? What we have to argue and explain, though, is that it's not just in those sectors, it's all sectors of the economy. I'll come back to David Graeber in a moment because I think that's a very good point. But if you look at the water industry, 76 billion pounds has been paid in dividends to the private sector in the 30 years of privatisation. Another 15 billion will be paid out in the rest of this decade. Only 10 billion is earmarked for investment in the infrastructure over the next short-term period, and that's going to be borrowed, putting greater increasing costs. So what we want, obviously, if we want to invest in the infrastructure for water, that's going to take workers, it's going to take science, it's going to take computer technology, it's going to take excavation machines, it's going to take engineering, it's going to take construction. Why do we not see the need for all of those aspects of the economy also to be under public control and not subject to the profit motive? We have no control over it. The question of housing, again, it's a question of profit. Why do we not take over the Barratts, the Wimpys, and organise construction on the basis of social need, not through a nationalised sector that sits on society, but where the working class control? And that's why I come back to this question of the state. What we have at the moment is a capitalist state, and the state manages capitalism for the capitalists. What we need is the working class to fight for power and to attain state power, changing the state completely, making it an instrument for working class rule. And here's the important thing. All states hitherto have been states acting in the interest of the minority ruling class, whether that's slave-owning societies, feudal societies, or capitalist societies. The state is an instrument of repression or oppression on behalf of the minority. If the working class attained state power, it would, for the first time in history, be a state that's acting in the interest of the majority class, of the majority in society. So the nature of the state is entirely different. Everybody is a worker, then nobody is a boss. And picking up on what Chris said, the owners of capital now, they can join their fellow workers working the 10-hour week, getting the decent health service, getting the free transport, and so on. The need for a repressive state in those circumstances, when classes have disappeared, there is no longer any need for a repressive state, and the state disappears. And as Engels again put it in Anti-Düring, or in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, he says that the government of people is replaced by the administration of things. And that's the sort of society that I think communist socialists are aspiring to, a classless society with no state, in which production is organized by people on the basis of the needs of society. And if you come back to that David Graeber point, if you have a society of abundance, which I believe that socialism would be, that is, it produces and meets the needs of people in terms of health, food, warmth, water, education, then areas of the economy now, such as pensions, they disappear. Why? Because society organizes from the here and now to plan for the future, for the care of the elderly, the sick, the weak, the disabled, and the young. And it organizes the labor time that is available to ensure that that comes out of what's been built in the past and what can be done in the here and now. Insurance, the same. People would get what they needed, socially determined. Security. Why do we need so many people securing supermarkets, shopping centres and so on? Because people fear, or the owners fear, that people are going to steal. Why do people steal? Because they don't have what they need. That's primarily the situation. All of these things are socially determined. One aspect that Ian mentioned, I mentioned it in the article. Food. Why on earth do we allow food to be privately owned? Why are we subject to the market in that? Again, the question of health. We have a so-called NHS. What about the pharmaceutical companies that make billions every year providing the drugs to the NHS? So we can make all of these arguments, and I think we've got very, very strong, compelling arguments. In my opinion, the argument really is about changing fundamentally the very basis of society, not just sectors of the economy that are seen as being utilities in the public sector of a capitalist state, serving primarily the needs of the capitalist economy, but public ownership, democratically controlled, organized by the people, on behalf of the people. Everybody works, everybody contributes, and you end up with the situation that is envisaged by Marx in his critique of the Gotha program, where you have a society in which each contributes according to their ability and each receives according to their need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. A very full conclusion to the discussion. So thank you all very much for joining and for making your contributions tonight. It's been a really good discussion. I found it very interesting, and I hope people who see it online subsequently do too. So we'll be reconvening in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks today, for another session. Nick, I don't know whether, can you tell us what that session will be about?
We're still sorting that out. We had, in fact, Gary will know a comrade that used to live in Peckham, Hannah Cross, who's written a book on migration beyond capitalism, had agreed to speak, but she's had to put it back to the following fortnight. So we're just in the process of filling that gap.
Okay, thanks. So watch this space for the topic in a fortnight. If you haven't noticed, also we've revamped the look and feel of the website. So if you've got any thoughts on that, please get back to us with comments. And we'll look forward to talking to you all again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Good night.